Hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for another video. Today I want to give you my final thoughts on the pens and inks that I used in April of 2023. So the first pen that I used was the Asvine V126. This is a vacuum fill pen with a medium nib. I recently purchased this fountain pen on Etsy and I was so excited to try it out because it has this really strong bold blue color. I wanted to give it an equally strong blue ink. I needed a full ink bottle for this vacuum fill pen, so I ended up inking it up with the Leonardo Officina Italiana blue. Let's show some samples. This is an example of what the ink looks like. It was actually really pleasant to write with. It was almost too thick for the A5 Hobonichi grid size. I felt like I really wanted to use it with a larger grid size. So this is also Tomoe River paper. One of the things that I completely forgot about is the shutoff valve for vacuum fill pens. So you might notice that the blue got lighter and lighter the more I wrote with it because I forgot to open that valve for the pen. But other than that, other than the pen going drier and drier because it was running out of ink, it was being starved of ink, this was a great experience. It was actually really nice. I'll say it was a good pairing. It wasn't my favorite, but I have absolutely no complaints aside from user error. The next ink and pen combination that I used was the Visconti Mirage Mythos in the Aphrodite colorway with a fine nib. This was a super wet writer last month. In the month of March, I had inked it up with Colorverse Pillars of Creation, a super wet ink in a super wet pen, and it was a joy to write with, but it just took forever to dry. So I wanted to try it with a drier ink, and I inked this one up with Diamine Memory Lane. So this was one of the two Diamine Inkvent colors, Inkvent inks that I wanted to use for the month of April. Let's take a look at some writing samples with Diamine Memory Lane. I hope you're able to see like the shimmer in this ink. I love the color. I love the shimmer. And the only issue that I had with this fountain pen was the fact that I had to open this up every single time and agitate the ink. Make sure that the shimmer was reincorporated into the ink itself. Yes, because this pen is completely opaque. It would be really great if Visconti actually came out with translucent or a sort of semi-demonstrator model of the Visconti Mirage Mythos, because this is a beautiful pen. I love to write with it and I love capping and uncapping it. And it actually wrote like a true fine with this ink. The next pen and ink combination was the Kaweco collection, Iridescent Pearl. And I had this one inked up with the second Diamine Inkvent color, One More Sleep. It's a nice blue color. It doesn't seem very, I don't know, it was a simple, highly shading ink, but it performed very well in this pen. And I loved the combination of the two, the pen and the ink together. So it was a really nice combination. And this nib, I actually didn't realize how smooth this nib was until this month. This is a fine nib and it's so tiny. It's so little, it's so cute and little. And I realized that the Kaweco nib is much smaller than the number 5 Yovo nib. Random discovery for this month. It's a very small, but very, very nice, smooth, reliable nib. The next pen and ink combination is the Pilot Custom 74 Smoky Black with a fine nib. You can probably tell that it's still inked up. And this one has Robert Oster Summer Storm. Now, at first, I was very underwhelmed by this fountain pen. I was partially turned off by the feedback in this nib. It has a very, very distinct, almost rough, I don't want to say rough, but rough feedback. But after writing with it for maybe a couple sentences, I kind of get in the groove of just enjoying the feel of this nib on the paper. I don't even know. This is so nice. It feels so good. It feels really good in the hand. And when writing on the paper, that feedback just puts me into like some meditative state. So this very subtle, very soft gray color with an almost gray ink as well. It's like a bluish gray, but it was so pleasant. It was always a shock with the first couple of lines writing with this fountain pen, but after that, the time just flew by and I always enjoyed writing with this eventually. The next pen is the TWSBI Eco Smoke Rose Gold with a medium nib, inked with Robert Oster Rose Gold Antiqua. And you will see that there is absolutely no ink in this pen. The diagnostic test went well enough. I'm so glad that I got all of that ink and that shimmer rinsed out of this pen. I actually had to remove the nib and the feed to get the shimmer particles out. This one was a challenge. I did get it to write very reliably most of the time, but it was only reliable when I was writing with it consistently. So every single day or every other day. There was a period of time in the month of April when I did not use this pen for about a week. And when I attempted to write with it again, it was completely dried up in the nib. And it took me some time, some effort to really get the pen to write again. So I was doing my best to just get it to write. It would not work. I turned it over, tried to get some of the ink out like this, and it actually worked right here, but still when I turned the nib back over and tried to write with it, nothing came out. So what I had to do, I had to actually prime the feed to push the shimmer out of this area. The pen was clogged because of the shimmer itself. The ink was fine, but the shimmer was clogging up this area inside the barrel. And I'm so glad that I put it in a demonstrator pen where I could see exactly what was going on. So once I primed the feed, it performed just fine. So I made sure that I did not go more than 1 to 2 days. I made sure I wrote something with this pen every single day or every other day until I just emptied the pen. I guess this color doesn't exactly resonate with me anymore, or as much as it did in the month of April. And I believe that what I loved the most about this ink was that rose gold or that champagne colored shimmer that warmed up this shade of pink. You may or may not be able to tell, there is not much shimmer that was laid down on this paper or this one. There is plenty of shimmer here, while I was still able to get it to write, but it was never consistent whenever I wrote. This is not exactly my favorite shade of pink. It's a little bit too cool for me. I would actually love to try some other pinks, such as the Teranishi Guitar, Opera Rose, Laban Aphrodite, and even Ferris Wheel Press Spadina Rose. So those warmer, almost peachy color, peachy shade of pink, those are the ones that I would really love to try now. And I'm just gonna let this one go. I'm probably gonna give this to a pen pal. I'm so glad that I actually tried this. And now that I have spent some time with the ink and a really good pen, I know that I would prefer other inks. Okay, so next is the Pelikan M400 white tortoiseshell with the extra fine nib. This was inked with Sailor Shikiori Rikyucha, and it was one of my favorites for the month of April. I really enjoyed this ink. This is really nice, warm shade of green that also leans or shades brown. And I like my greens and browns, the ones that transition from one shade to the other. I really like this ink and I really liked it in this pen. The only issue that I had with this pen is there might be a little bit of some misalignment going on. So I believe from left to right, there is a little bit of scratchiness going on with this pen. But other than that, it was a really great pairing. One of my favorite pairings. The next one is the Pilot Vanishing Point Matte Black with a fine nib. This one was inked up with Sailor Yurameku Sukigokoro. The ink was surprising to me because in the ink swatch on the coloring card, it looked, I guess the brown sheen just completely took over the card. I thought this was going to be a brown ink, but it turned out to be a very cool toned green. It's like almost a desaturated teal with a little bit of that reddish brown sheen. So I didn't quite gravitate towards this ink color, but I gravitated towards this pen. I wasn't crazy about the ink, but I am crazy about the pen. This pen is awesome. This pen is great. The next pen and ink combination was the Franklin-Christoph Model 3. This is such a bright, cheerful color. I really love it. And this has a medium sig nib, and it was inked up with Sailor Yurameku Kokoroguma. Initially, it was a great ink experience, great pen and ink pairing. I really loved how the nib felt on the paper. I really like this reddish brown sheen that the ink has. But after a while, I started to avoid this pen because the ink became wetter and wetter and wetter. And eventually it started feeling like a watercolor brush that was fully loaded and trying to write with that. It was a very, very different sensation where the nib just felt way too wet. Like I was afraid that ink was just gonna spurt out of the pen. I actually had to clean out the cap a couple of times because ink would always just splatter inside the nib. And it always felt like it was gonna do that whenever I wrote with the pen as well. So there were a couple times where I just avoided this pen altogether because the ink just felt a little bit too wet coming out of this medium sig nib. This next pen and ink combination was just, it was such a beautiful one. It was beautiful. It was so beautiful. I really loved the color. So if you've watched my April ink flight unboxing, the last two inks were from my April 2023 ink flight unboxing video. And the ink that was in here was Colorverse Hwang, and this is Hwang. This ink color is so beautiful, but it is so difficult to read. It is so difficult to read. And I put it in my wettest nib. This is the BENU Talisman Venus Hair with a medium nib. This pen writes super duper wet. I had a Diamine ink in it a month or two ago, and it was wonderful. It was one of my favorite pen and ink combinations in the past. But with this one, initially this ink was way too dry. It would barely come out of the nib, even when I was just writing down the pen and ink pairings for the month of April. So you might be able to see that was a hard start right there. There was actually a hard start with BENU and a couple other letters as well. But I was able to get the pen to work using Van Ness's White Lightning. That stuff is awesome. If you are having trouble writing with a super dry ink that it just won't come out of the pen, it just will not cooperate, try White Lightning. White Lightning worked a miracle for this pen and this ink. My only issue is whenever I write with this color, I don't want to read what I wrote. I knew it from the beginning that it was going to be super light. It's sitting in front of me, but it doesn't look like words. I could only write with that pen under bright lights. Since I could not see what I was writing, I had to use the glare of the wet ink to see. Now for the Colorverse Hwang, I attempted to use a different type of nib, and I was able to get some really legible writing. With the calligraphy nib, like, it works really well. So if you want to do some larger, more decorative, fancier writing, then this ink would actually work. But for everyday writing, not so much. And the last pen and ink combination was the Franklin-Christoph Model 45 with a fine cursive italic nib. This pen had Colorverse Tang Peyong. It was a beautiful purple, but it actually surprised me that this ink was lighter in the pen. I was expecting it to be a deeper shade of purple. I was expecting it to be this deep, but it was very, very light in the fine cursive italic nib. This ink was also a little bit dry, so it did not feel like this nib was lubricated at all. So whenever I was writing with it, I definitely felt the sharp corners of the cursive italic nib. And so it was not a very pleasant experience for me. It did not feel like an everyday writer. So I emptied this pen as well. Okay, so just reviewing. This is the Leonardo Blue, Diamine Memory Lane, Diamine One More Sleep, Robert Oster Summer Storm, Robert Oster Rose Gold Antiqua, Sailor Shikiori Rikyucha, Sailor Yurameku Sukigokoro, Sailor Yurameku Kokoroguma, Colorverse Tang Peyong, and Colorverse Hwang. This is Tomoe River paper, Midori, and Iroful. Interesting. So if you look at Sukigokoro, it looks like on Tomoe River paper, it looks like a very straightforward muted teal color. On here, you can see a bit more brown on the Midori paper. And Iroful, it's almost a bluish color. It's more blue than on here. It's a much more bold color. I really like how the Sukigokoro looks on Iroful paper. In Kokoroguma, this is what I was expecting to see, but it was much wetter in practice. So I would like to see Kokoroguma in a drier nib. So maybe the Pilot Kakuno with a fine or a medium nib. I would really love to see that. Thanks to Simona and Karina Loves to Plan, many others who are adopting scoring or feedback, some way to give feedback on each of these pen and ink pairings. So I'm just gonna do like a very simple ranking for these pens. My favorite overall writing experience for the month of April, it came with the Pilot Vanishing Point and the Sailor Yurameku Sukigokoro, which was a surprise to me because in the beginning of the month, I was really not excited about using this pen because of the ink itself, because of the green color that turned out to be a little bit cooler than I was expecting, cooler than I really wanted. I wanted a warm brownish green, but this was a cool desaturated teal with a hint towards the brown side of things, depending on which paper you were using. But around 10 o'clock on April the 30th, this shot up to first place and it edged out the Pelikan M400 Sailor Shikiori Rikyucha. This ink color is probably my favorite ink color, but because of the fact that I need to take a look at this nib and there's some scratchiness, maybe some misalignment going on, it lost first place to my Pilot Vanishing point. Like I really enjoyed the smoothness of this nib. This was the best writing experience that I've had in the month of April. Let's see if I can rearrange these. That's my first place pen and my second place pen. My third place is actually right here, the Kaweco collection with Iridescent and the Iridescent Pearl with the Diamine One More Sleep. This was a very smooth writer as well. It was actually smoother than the Pilot nib. This Pilot Custom 74 nib was not smooth like this one. It's got some feedback, but it was very pleasant to write with. And I felt, I don't know, it's like the feedback on some nibs kind of gives me a calming effect on me. And so it felt like self-care writing with this pen, and it also kind of disappeared into the background because of the gray color and because of this bluish gray ink as well. All I had to do was just focus on my thoughts in the moment. So that was a very pleasant experience. Number 5 was actually the Asvine V126. This was a very pleasant, very juicy, very wet writer, and the blue ink in this pen was very pleasant, and I believe that I probably would have had a much better experience had I realized that I was supposed to open the valve. Number 6 is the Franklin-Christoph Model 3 Lemon Yellow and Amber Swirl with the medium SIG nib. The only reason why it ranked so low was because the ink was so wet in this pen, and it felt like I was always on the verge of having an ink emergency. Number 7 is the TWSBI Eco Smoke Rose Gold with the Robert Oster Rose Gold Antiqua. I got it to work, but after much frustration, I just know that I'm probably not going to want to write with that ink every day in order to keep it writing. I prefer other ink colors. It wasn't a favorite. Number 8 is Diamine Memory Lane in the Visconti Mirage Mythos, only because I had to continue to disassemble the pen just to make sure that the ink was agitated. If it was a demonstrator pen, then it absolutely would have been up here, probably somewhere around here. I think I would only do non-shimmer inks in this pen from now on, but I do know that it can handle shimmer inks. It can handle drier inks. Number 9 is the Franklin-Christoph Model 45 with the fine cursive italic nib, only because the ink was a little bit too dry for this nib. This was one of my favorites in the month of February when it was inked up with Diamine Deck the Halls. It was a very deep purple with the pink shimmer, and it wrote so nicely. I actually realized and noticed that there was a bounce to this nib, and it was a joy to write with. It was so pleasant. So I know that I enjoy writing with fine cursive italic nibs if the ink is a wet one. And so last place is the BENU Talisman Venus Hair with a medium nib and Colorverse Don Hwang. Regardless of all of my efforts to get it to write properly, it was still very frustrating to use. It was so frustrating that I actually did not use it at all in my journaling. I would love to get more into yellow inks, but only legible ones from now on. So those are my final thoughts for the pens and inks that I used for the month of April. Ooh, I have a question for you. I used Van Ness White Lightning to get Colorverse Don Hwang to work in this pen, and it was a very pleasant experience. It actually wrote almost juicy. It was almost juicy in this nib. And it was a pleasant writing experience. It was just a horrendous reading experience trying to use that ink. Do you have any interest in seeing like before and afters for super dry inks that probably would not work without White Lightning? I would be interested in testing out super dry inks that didn't work for me in the past and seeing if White Lightning made a difference in my experience. So for example, Ferris Wheel Press, Little Robinia. Let me see if I have a sample writing of that. Ferris Ferris Wheel Press Little Robinia was one of those inks that I was so excited about writing with, and it was early on in my fountain pen journey. And it was, I had it in a TWSBI, one of my TWSBI pens. So I'm not sure if it was probably a TWSBI medium nib, and it started writing out so well, and I loved it. And then I realized that I started to see more and more shading until it got so dry that it was just too frustrating to continue. So with White Lightning, I believe that I'd be able to get a writing experience like this consistently, no matter how much I wrote, because that was the same experience that I had with Don Hwang. It skipped at the very beginning of everything. The first couple lines of text, it would always skip, but throughout this entire writing experience, it was completely normal. But with this one, I might be able to read it. It might be able to perform properly in any pen that I use if I added White Lightning to it. So let me know if this is interesting to you, or if you'd like to see something else. Any other video recommendations that you have, please drop them in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. Love to hear your feedback on these pens, if you have any of them, or if you have any recommendations on the types of inks that I should check out, I should try out. I am all ears. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.